Welcome, kind listener, to this peaceful haven of history. This is a place where stories flow like a gentle river, carrying us far away from the rush of the present. Whether you are lying in bed, eyes growing heavy, or sitting quietly as the evening settles, know that you are among friends here. If you'd like, share in the comments where you are listening from. I treasure the chance to see how history brings together people from every corner of the world. And if these calm journeys speak to you, go ahead and subscribe, so our paths may cross again in the chapters to come. But for now, let the noise of today drift away, and join me as we wander softly into the mists of the past. Our story tonight begins not with a thunderclap or a declaration of war, but with something quieter, something that builds slowly like dawn light spreading across an ancient plain. It begins with a dream carried in the hearts of nomadic people, with the whisper of ambition in the mind of a young warrior, and with the patient turning of centuries that would transform a small principality on the edges of the known world into an empire that stretched across 3 continents and endured for more than 600 years. This is the story of the Ottoman Empire, and it is a story written not just in the grand chronicles of sultans and conquests, but in the daily rhythms of countless lives, in the call to prayer echoing across minarets, in the scent of spices drifting through covered bazaars, in the scratch of calligraphers' reed on parchment, and in the gentle lapping of waves against the shores of the Bosphorus. Long before there was an empire, there were the Turks, pastoral peoples whose ancestors had ridden across the vast steppes of Central Asia for centuries beyond counting. They were herders and warriors, moving with their flocks beneath skies so wide they seemed to hold eternity itself. The Turks carried with them a culture shaped by the endless horizons of the steppe, by the harsh beauty of a landscape where survival meant strength, adaptability, and an intimate knowledge of horses, weather, and the art of the bow. They worshipped the sky and the spirits of their ancestors, and they lived by codes of honor forged in the crucible of nomadic life. But the world was changing around them, as worlds always do. In the 11th century, one branch of these Turkish peoples, the Seljuks, began moving westward in great waves, driven by pressures from the east and drawn by opportunities in the west. They were fierce warriors who had converted to Islam, carrying with them a new faith that would blend with their ancient traditions to create something distinctive. The Seljuks crashed like a tide against the borders of the Byzantine Empire, that ancient continuation of Rome itself, and at the Battle of Manzikert in the year 1071, they achieved a victory so complete that it opened the gates of Anatolia to Turkish settlement. Into that vast plateau, with its snow-capped mountains and fertile valleys, its ancient cities and forgotten roads, came wave after wave of Turkish tribes, seeking new pastures, new opportunities, new lives. Among these many tribes and clans, there was one that history would remember, though at the time they were unremarkable, just another group of perhaps 400 families following their leader, a man named Ertugrul. The stories say that Ertugrul and his followers came upon a battle in progress, 2 forces locked in combat, and that he chose to aid the weaker side, which happened to be fighting for the Seljuk Sultan. Whether this tale is truth or legend born from later nostalgia, we cannot know for certain, but what matters is that Ertugrul was granted lands on the frontier, the dangerous borderlands between the declining Seljuk realm and the still formidable Byzantine Empire. It was a harsh gift, land that had to be defended and expanded, but it was also an opportunity. When Ertugrul died, leadership passed to his son, a young man named Osman, and it is from this man that the empire would take its name. Osman, born around 1258, inherited a small territory, perhaps no more than a few fortified towns and the countryside around them, perched on the edge of Byzantine Bithynia. The world into which Osman came of age was fragmenting. The Seljuk Sultanate, once mighty, was crumbling under the weight of Mongol invasions and internal decay. The Byzantine Empire, though it still held Constantinople and maintained the fiction of universal authority, was a shadow of its former glory, its territories reduced, its resources strained, its provinces increasingly autonomous. Into this vacuum of power, ambitious frontier lords like Osman could expand. But Osman was not merely a raider or a bandit chieftain. He was a builder, a man who understood that lasting power required more than just the ability to take territory. It required the wisdom to hold it, to govern it, to make people want to be part of what you were creating. He attracted followers not just through success in battle but through fairness in administration, through the promise of opportunity, through the creation of something that felt like it had a future. Byzantine peasants, weary of heavy taxation and ineffective protection, sometimes welcomed Osman's rule. Dispossessed warriors from other Turkish groups joined his banner. Slowly, incrementally, his small beylik, his principality, grew. There is a story told about Osman, one of those tales that may be more poetry than history, but which reveals something true about how the Ottomans understood themselves. One night, while Osman was a guest in the house of a holy man named Shikadebali, he had a dream. In this dream, he saw a great tree growing from his navel, its branches spreading to cover the entire world, sheltering mountains and rivers and peoples. He saw the 4 great rivers of paradise flowing from its roots, and he saw himself and his descendants as the guardians of this cosmic order. When he awoke and told the sheikh of his dream, Idebali interpreted it as a divine sign that Osman's descendants would establish a great empire. Whether Osman actually had such a dream or whether the story was created later to give sacred legitimacy to Ottoman rule, it speaks to something important, the sense that the empire was not just about conquest but about bringing order to chaos, about creating a shelter beneath which diverse peoples could live. Osman's early conquests were modest but methodical. He took the town of Yenishehir and made it his capital. He besieged the Byzantine fortresses that dotted his frontier, cutting them off from Constantinople, isolating them until they surrendered. He defeated a Byzantine force at Bapheus in 1302, a victory that announced to the wider world that this was not just another frontier warlord but a serious power. When Osman died around 1324, he left to his son Orhan a principality that had grown from a frontier lordship into a small state, one that controlled much of northwestern Anatolia and was positioned to expand further. Orhan, who ruled from 1324 to 1362, proved to be even more capable than his father. He was a man who combined military skill with administrative acumen, who understood that an empire required not just armies but institutions. Under Orhan, the Ottomans took the important city of Bursa in 1326 after a long siege, and Orhan made it his new capital. Bursa, with its position on the Silk Road, its wealth, its baths and mosques, became the first truly urban center of the Ottoman state. Here, in the shadow of Mount Uludag, Orhan began to build not just a capital but the foundations of imperial administration. It was also under Orhan that the Ottomans made their first crossing into Europe, an event whose consequences would shape centuries. In 1352, an earthquake damaged the fortifications at Gallipoli, on the European side of the Dardanelles, and the Ottomans seized the opportunity, occupying the town before the Byzantines could repair their defenses. This was more than just taking another fortress. This was the establishment of a permanent foothold in Europe, a bridgehead from which the Ottomans could expand into the Balkans. Byzantine appeals for help to the Christian powers of Europe went largely unheeded, for those powers were preoccupied with their own wars and quarrels. Orhan also began the systematic organization of the Ottoman military and administrative system. He created the first regular infantry units, the beginnings of what would become the famous Janissary Corps. He organized the conquered territories into provinces with appointed governors. He minted the first Ottoman coins. He built mosques, schools, and charitable foundations. He married Theodora, the daughter of a Byzantine prince, cementing alliances and demonstrating the Ottomans' willingness to work within the existing structures of power even as they undermined them. When Orhan died in 1362, the small frontier principality his father had left him had become a significant regional power, controlling much of northwestern Anatolia and possessing a foothold in Europe that would change the course of history. Orhan's son Murad I, who ruled from 1362 to 1389, accelerated the expansion into the Balkans with an intensity that alarmed the Christian kingdoms of southeastern Europe. Murad was a warrior sultan in the classical mold, a man who spent much of his reign in military campaigns, pushing the boundaries of Ottoman territory ever outward. He took Adrianople in 1369, a city second only to Constantinople itself in the Byzantine imagination, and made it his capital, renaming it Edirne. This move was symbolically profound. The Ottoman capital was now in Europe, not Asia. The empire's center of gravity was shifting, and with it, the Ottomans were declaring themselves not just a Turkish state but a Balkan power, a Mediterranean power, a European power. Under Murad, the Ottomans conquered large parts of Thrace, Macedonia, and Bulgaria. The Great Bulgarian Kingdom fell to Ottoman arms, its capital Tarnovo captured, its emperor reduced to vassalage and then eliminated entirely. The Serbian princes, who had once dominated the region, found themselves increasingly surrounded and threatened. Christian coalitions formed to stop the Ottoman advance, but they were hampered by internal divisions, by the difficulty of coordinating across different kingdoms and principalities, by the competing ambitions of local rulers who sometimes saw more danger in their Christian neighbors than in the advancing Ottomans. It was during Murad's reign that the Janissary Corps became a truly formidable force. The Janissaries were created through a system called devshirme, a practice that would become one of the most distinctive features of Ottoman governance. Christian boys, primarily from the Balkans, were taken from their families at a young age, converted to Islam, and raised in the Sultan's service. The most capable were trained as Janissaries, an elite infantry force that owed loyalty to the Sultan alone, not to tribal or regional allegiances. The Janissaries were forbidden to marry, at least in the early centuries, and they lived in barracks in the capital, ready to march at a moment's notice. They were trained in firearms as these weapons became available, and they combined discipline and firepower in a way that gave them an edge over the more traditional feudal levies of their enemies. The devshirme system was, by modern standards, a form of slavery, a forced removal of children from their families. Yet within the Ottoman context, it was also a path to power and influence that was in some ways more meritocratic than the hereditary systems of Europe. A Janissary could rise to become a commander, a provincial governor, even a grand vizier, the Sultan's chief minister. Many of the most powerful men in Ottoman history were devshirme recruits who had come from Christian peasant families and risen through their abilities. This was part of the genius and the cruelty of the Ottoman system, that it could take the sons of conquered peoples and make them the instruments of further conquest, and in doing so, create a military and administrative class whose loyalty was to the empire itself rather than to tribal or familial connections. Murad's reign ended dramatically. In 1389, he led his armies to Kosovo, to the Field of Blackbirds, to meet a coalition of Serbian and Bosnian forces under Prince Lazar. The Battle of Kosovo became one of those events that transcends its immediate military significance to become myth, especially in Serbian culture, where it has been remembered as a tragic last stand against overwhelming odds. The historical reality was more ambiguous. The battle was hard-fought and both sides suffered enormous casualties. Murad himself was killed, assassinated by a Serbian knight who pretended to defect and then stabbed the Sultan when brought before him. But the Serbian army was shattered, Prince Lazar was captured and executed, and what remained of Serbian independence was effectively ended. Murad's son Bayezid, who was present at the battle, immediately assumed power, reportedly having his brother strangled to prevent a succession dispute, a grim precedent that would become Ottoman practice for generations. Bayezid I, who ruled from 1389 to 1402, earned the nickname Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, for the speed of his military campaigns. He was a sultan of tremendous energy and ambition, perhaps too much ambition. He expanded Ottoman power both in Anatolia and in Europe, subduing rival Turkish principalities in Asia Minor and pushing deeper into the Balkans. He besieged Constantinople itself multiple times, tightening the noose around the Byzantine capital, though he never managed to take it. He defeated a crusade at Nicopolis in 1396, a crusade that had brought together knights from across Europe under Hungarian leadership, full of confidence and chivalric idealism, only to be smashed by Ottoman tactics and discipline. But Bayezid's ambition led him to overreach. In Anatolia, he moved aggressively against other Muslim states, taking territory that had once belonged to rival beyliks, centralizing power in a way that alarmed many. This brought him into conflict with Timur, known in the west as Tamerlane, the Turco-Mongol conqueror who had built a vast empire stretching from India to the Mediterranean. Timur claimed to be restoring the realm of Genghis Khan, and he viewed Bayezid's conquests in Anatolia as encroachment on territory that rightfully belonged to him. The two great conquerors met at the Battle of Ankara in 1402, and there, in the Anatolian heartland, Bayezid's army was destroyed. The Sultan himself was captured and died in captivity. The Ottoman state, which had seemed on the verge of becoming the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean, was suddenly thrown into chaos. The period that followed, known as the Ottoman Interregnum, was one of civil war and near collapse. Bayezid's sons fought among themselves for the throne, each claiming legitimacy, each controlling different portions of the empire. For over a decade, it seemed possible that the Ottoman Empire would fragment entirely, that it would become just another failed dynasty in the tumultuous history of Anatolia. Byzantine emperors briefly regained some independence. The Turkish principalities that Bayezid had conquered reasserted their autonomy. Christian powers in the Balkans breathed more easily, believing the Ottoman threat had passed. But they were wrong. One of Bayezid's sons, Mehmed, who had been the youngest and initially seemed the least likely to prevail, emerged victorious from the civil war. Mehmed I, who ruled from 1413 to 1421, spent his reign not in conquest but in restoration, patiently rebuilding the empire his father had nearly destroyed. He reintegrated the Anatolian territories, brought the Balkans back under firm control, and re-established the authority of the central government. He faced rebellions, including a significant uprising led by a charismatic preacher named Sheikh Bedreddin and a mysterious figure called Duzmi Mustafa, false Mustafa, who claimed to be another of Bayezid's sons. Mehmed suppressed these challenges with a combination of military force and political acumen, and when he died in 1421, he left his son an empire that had survived its greatest crisis and was ready, once again, to expand. That son was Murad II, who ruled from 1421 to 1451, with a brief interruption when he tried to abdicate in favor of his young son, only to be called back when crisis threatened. Murad was a complex figure, a skilled general and administrator who nevertheless seemed at times weary of the burdens of power, attracted to the contemplative life, to poetry and mysticism. But the needs of the empire kept pulling him back to the battlefield. He fought wars in the Balkans against Hungarian forces, defeated another crusade at Varna in 1444, and expanded Ottoman control throughout the region. He also had to manage a delicate balance within the empire between competing factions, between the traditional Turkish aristocracy and the rising power of the Devshirme-trained administrators, between the Janissaries and the provincial cavalry, between different religious scholars and their schools of thought. When Murad died in 1451, his son Mehmed succeeded him, a young man of 19 who had already briefly served as sultan during his father's attempted abdication. The Christian powers, particularly the Byzantines, hoped that a young sultan would mean a period of weakness, of breathing room. They could not have been more mistaken. The young man who took the throne as Mehmed II would earn the title Fatih, the Conqueror, and would achieve what 7 centuries of Islamic rulers had attempted and failed to do. He would take Constantinople. Constantinople, the city of Constantine, the new Rome, had stood for over 1,000 years as the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the greatest city in Christendom, a place of legendary wealth and culture, protected by the most formidable fortifications in the world. The Theodosian walls, built in the 5th century, had turned back countless sieges. The city's position on a peninsula, protected by water on 3 sides and by those massive triple walls on the landward side, made it seem nearly impregnable. Within those walls were churches of breathtaking beauty, libraries filled with ancient knowledge, palaces adorned with mosaics that glowed like captured sunlight, and a population that remembered, even in reduced circumstances, that they were the inheritors of Rome itself. But by 1453, when Mehmed laid siege to the city, Byzantine power was more memory than reality. The empire had been reduced to little more than the capital itself and a few isolated outposts. The population of the city, which had once numbered in the hundreds of thousands, had dwindled to perhaps 50,000. Whole districts lay empty and ruined. The treasury was bare, unable to pay for adequate defense. The emperor, Constantine XI, was a brave and capable man, but he ruled over ruins, and he knew it. He had appealed desperately to the Christian powers of Europe for aid, but little came. Venice and Genoa sent some ships and soldiers, but nothing like what was needed. Mehmed prepared for the siege with meticulous care. He built a fortress, Rumeli Hazari, on the European shore of the Bosphorus, across from an earlier fortress on the Asian side, effectively cutting off Constantinople's sea access to the north. He assembled an army estimated at somewhere between 80,000 and perhaps twice that number, accounts vary. He brought with him a new weapon that would change warfare forever, massive cannon capable of hurling stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds against fortifications. The largest of these, cast by a Hungarian engineer named Urban who had offered his services first to the Byzantines but was hired by Mehmed when they couldn't afford his price, was a monster of a gun that required dozens of oxen to move and a crew of hundreds to operate. The siege began on April 6, 1453, and it lasted for 54 days. From the beginning, it was clear that the city was doomed, but the defenders fought with desperate courage, repairing breaches in the walls each night that the Ottoman cannon had created during the day, repelling assault after assault, led by the emperor himself who fought alongside his men, indistinguishable from a common soldier except for his courage. The Ottomans tried multiple tactics. They attempted to tunnel under the walls, but the Byzantines, led by a Scottish soldier named John Grant, detected the tunnels and destroyed them. They tried to sail ships into the Golden Horn, the harbor that was blocked by a massive chain, so Mehmed had ships dragged overland on greased logs and launched them into the harbor from the landward side, a feat that shocked the defenders. As the siege wore on, the defenders grew more exhausted, their numbers thinned by casualties, their supplies dwindling, their hope fading. On the night of May 28, Mehmed ordered one final massive assault for the next morning. He promised his soldiers 3 days of plunder, a powerful incentive. That night, inside the city, Emperor Constantine attended a final service in the Hagia Sophia, the great church of holy wisdom, praying alongside his subjects, Orthodox and Catholic united in extremity. Then he returned to the walls to await the dawn. The final assault began before sunrise on May 29, 1453. Wave after wave of Ottoman soldiers attacked the walls, first irregulars and adventurers, then the regular troops, and finally the Janissaries. The exhausted defenders held as long as they could, but the walls had been weakened by weeks of bombardment, and the numbers were overwhelmingly against them. At a critical moment, some Ottoman soldiers found a small postern gate, the Kirkaporta, that had been left unlocked or broken, accounts differ. They poured through, gaining access to the space between the inner and outer walls. At about the same time, Giovanni Giustiniani, a Genoese soldier who had been the most effective military leader of the defense, was wounded and withdrew to one of the ships in the harbor, an act that broke the morale of his men. The line collapsed. Emperor Constantine, seeing that all was lost, reportedly tore off his imperial regalia and threw himself into the final desperate fighting, choosing to die as a soldier rather than be captured. His body was never definitively identified. The Ottomans poured into the city, and what followed was the customary 3 days of plunder that Mehmed had promised. Soldiers ransacked homes and churches, took treasures, enslaved inhabitants. Many ancient texts were lost, though not as many as legend sometimes claims, for the Byzantines had been selling off their library collections for decades to raise money, and much had already been carried to Italy. Some of the population was killed, though again, the numbers were not as catastrophic as some later Christian accounts suggested, because there simply weren't that many people left in the city. On the third day, Mehmed entered the city in state and went directly to the Hagia Sophia. He dismounted at the threshold, picked up a handful of dirt, and poured it over his head in a gesture of humility before God. Inside the great church, he stopped a soldier who was breaking up the marble floor tiles, reminding him that the plunder period was over and the city now belonged to the Sultan to dispose of as he wished. Then Mehmed climbed to the pulpit and declared that the Hagia Sophia was now a mosque. In the coming days, he would issue orders to protect the remaining population, to encourage people to return to the city, to rebuild and repopulate. He granted privileges to the Greek Orthodox Church, allowing the Christians of his empire to maintain their faith and their ecclesiastical structure under Ottoman protection, a policy that would continue throughout the empire's history. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through both Christian Europe and the Islamic world. In Europe, it was seen as a catastrophe, the end of the last remnant of the Roman Empire, a breach in the wall of Christendom. There was much talk of crusades to recapture the city, but nothing came of it. In the Islamic world, Mehmed was hailed as a Ghazi, a holy warrior, who had achieved what generations had failed to accomplish. But more practically, the conquest gave the Ottomans control of the strategic waterway between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, control of one of the great cities of the world, and the prestige and legitimacy that came with being the conquerors of Constantinople. Mehmed renamed the city Istanbul, a name that had been in informal use for centuries, derived from the Greek phrase eis tinpalin, meaning to the city, but which now became official. He set about rebuilding and repopulating it, offering incentives for people to move there, resettling populations from across the empire, Turks, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, creating the cosmopolitan metropolis that Istanbul would become. He built a new palace, the Topkapi Palace, on the site of the ancient Acropolis, overlooking the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn, a complex of buildings and gardens and courtyards that would serve as the administrative center of the empire for centuries. But Mehmed's ambitions didn't stop with Constantinople. Over the remaining years of his reign, which lasted until 1481, he conducted campaign after campaign, expanding the empire in multiple directions. He conquered the rest of the Byzantine remnants, including the Despotate of Morea in Greece and the Empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast. He subjugated Serbia completely, reducing it from a vassal state to a province. He fought wars in Anatolia against the Ikoyanlu, a Turkmen tribal confederation. He launched campaigns into the Balkans, into the Crimea, into Moldavia. Mehmed even attempted to expand into Italy, landing an army in Otranto in 1480 and briefly holding it, a move that terrified the Italian states with the prospect of Ottoman armies sweeping up the peninsula. Only Mehmed's death in 1481 ended that threat. He died at the age of 49, possibly poisoned, though the evidence is ambiguous, leaving behind an empire that had been transformed from a regional power into a world empire, one that controlled the strategic crossroads between Europe and Asia, between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, an empire that would be one of the great powers of the world for centuries to come. Mehmed was succeeded by his son Bayezid II, who ruled from 1481 to 1512. Bayezid's reign was longer but less militarily spectacular than his father's. He was a more contemplative man, interested in theology and mysticism, known for his patronage of poets and scholars. But this doesn't mean his reign was peaceful. He fought wars with the Mamluks in Egypt and Syria, with Venice over control of Mediterranean islands and coastal territories, with Hungary over the borderlands. He also had to contend with his brother Sem, who claimed the throne and, when defeated, fled to Europe where he became a pawn in diplomatic games, with various European powers holding him hostage and using the threat of supporting his claim to pressure the Ottoman Sultan. It was during Bayezid's reign that a new development occurred that would have long-term consequences. In Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella completed the Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to retake the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule, and in 1492 they conquered the last Muslim kingdom, Granada. That same year, they issued the Edict of Expulsion, ordering all Jews to convert to Christianity or leave Spain. Thousands of Spanish Jews, Sephardim, with their rich cultural and intellectual traditions, fled. Many went to North Africa, some to Italy, and many came to the Ottoman Empire, where Bayezid welcomed them. He is reported to have said, mocking Ferdinand, "You call Ferdinand a wise king, he who impoverishes his country and enriches ours." The influx of Sephardic Jews brought to Ottoman cities new skills in medicine, printing, finance, and trade. They settled primarily in Istanbul, Salonika, and other major cities, adding another layer to the empire's already diverse population. Bayezid's reign ended unhappily. His sons began fighting over the succession while he was still alive, and eventually one of them, Selim, marched on Istanbul with his army. Bayezid abdicated in 1512 and died shortly after, possibly poisoned by his son, though again evidence is unclear. Selim I, who ruled from 1512 to 1520, was a very different man from his father. He was called Yavuz, the Grim or the Resolute, and he earned the name. He was ruthless, energetic, and absolutely determined to expand the empire and consolidate his power. Selim's first concern was not Europe but the East, where a new threat had emerged. In Persia, the Safavid dynasty had risen to power, and they were not just political rivals but religious ones. The Safavids were Shia Muslims, and they were actively promoting their version of Islam, trying to convert the Turkish tribes of Anatolia, many of whom had Shia sympathies or belonged to heterodox Sufi orders that the Ottoman religious establishment viewed with suspicion. Selim saw this as both a political and religious threat. In 1514, he marched east with a large army and met the Safavid Shah Ismail at the Battle of Calderon. The Ottomans won decisively, thanks in large part to their superior use of gunpowder weapons, artillery, and muskets, which the more traditional Safavid cavalry could not match. Selim occupied the Safavid capital Tabriz, though he didn't hold it long, and he secured Ottoman control over eastern Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia. But Selim's most significant conquests came in the south. The Mamluk Sultanate, based in Egypt but controlling Syria, the Hijaz, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, was a wealthy and prestigious state but militarily outdated. The Mamluks were a caste of slave soldiers who had ruled Egypt for centuries, and they were superb horsemen and warriors in the traditional mode, but they had failed to adapt to gunpowder weapons. In 1516, Selim marched south, ostensibly to attack the Safavids but actually targeting the Mamluks. At the Battle of Marj Dabik, near Aleppo, the Ottoman army destroyed the Mamluk forces, and the Mamluk Sultan was killed. Syria fell to the Ottomans. The following year, 1517, Selim continued into Egypt. At the Battle of Raidanaya, outside Cairo, the Mamluks made a last stand and were annihilated. The Ottoman army entered Cairo, the greatest city of the Arab world, and the Mamluk Sultanate was finished. The conquest of the Mamluk lands was transformative for the Ottoman Empire. It roughly doubled the empire's population and revenue. It brought under Ottoman control the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, making the Ottoman Sultan the servant and protector of the two holy sanctuaries, a role that conferred immense prestige in the Islamic world. It brought control of the Red Sea and the trade routes to the Indian Ocean. And it brought the Ottomans into possession of the last claimant to the Abbasid Caliphate, a figurehead in Cairo who traced his lineage, however tenuously, to the early caliphs. There is a story, probably apocryphal, that this last Abbasid caliph formally transferred the caliphate to Selim. Whether this actually happened is debated by historians, but what matters is that from this point forward, the Ottoman sultans began to style themselves as caliphs, as the leaders not just of the Ottoman state but of the entire Islamic world. This claim was contested by other Muslim rulers, but it gave the Ottomans a source of legitimacy that transcended mere political power. Selim died in 1520, possibly from cancer, after a reign of only 8 years but one that had fundamentally reshaped the empire. He was succeeded by his only surviving son, Suleiman, who was 26 years old when he took the throne. Suleiman would rule for 46 years, from 1520 to 1566, the longest reign of any Ottoman sultan, and his reign would be the apex of Ottoman power and prestige. Europeans would call him Suleiman the Magnificent, awed by the splendor of his court and the reach of his power. His own people would call him Suleiman Kanuni, Suleiman the Lawgiver, for his work in systematizing the laws and institutions of the empire. Suleiman's reign began with military campaigns that seemed to promise unlimited expansion. In 1521, he captured Belgrade, the key fortress controlling the Danube and the gateway to Hungary. In 1522, he conquered the island of Rhodes after a long siege, driving out the Knights Hospitaller who had held it as a Christian outpost in the eastern Mediterranean. These victories announced that the new sultan was following in the footsteps of his warrior ancestors. But the greatest campaign came in 1526, when Suleiman marched into Hungary with a massive army to punish King Louis II, who had been raiding Ottoman territory. At the Battle of Mohacs, fought in a muddy field in southern Hungary, the Ottoman army utterly destroyed the Hungarian forces. King Louis was killed, either in the battle or drowning in a stream while fleeing, weighed down by his armor. The Hungarian kingdom, one of the major Christian powers of Central Europe, was shattered. In the aftermath, Hungary was divided. The Ottomans took direct control of the Central Plains, while Transylvania became an Ottoman vassal, and the northern and western regions fell under Habsburg control, setting up a border that would remain contested for centuries. In 1529, Suleiman pushed even further, marching on Vienna itself, the capital of the Habsburg Empire. The Siege of Vienna in 1529 was the high-water mark of Ottoman expansion in Europe. The city was defended with desperate determination by a garrison under Nicholas, Count of Somme, while Emperor Charles V was far away in Spain, unable to come to its relief. But autumn was coming on, and the Ottoman army was at the end of a very long supply line. The siege lasted only a few weeks before Suleiman, faced with approaching winter and stiffening resistance, broke it off and marched back to Istanbul. Vienna was saved, and though Suleiman would return to campaign in Hungary multiple times, he would never again come so close to the heart of the Habsburg realm. Suleiman's empire was not just expanding in Europe. Ottoman fleets dominated the Mediterranean, engaging in a long struggle with Spain and Venice for control of the sea. Ottoman corsairs, the most famous being Hayreddin Barbarossa, who was made admiral of the Ottoman fleet, raided Christian coastlines and captured ships, extending Ottoman power across North Africa. In the east, Suleiman fought multiple wars with the Safavids, capturing Baghdad in 1534 and extending Ottoman control over Iraq. In the Indian Ocean, Ottoman fleets challenged Portuguese dominance, supporting Muslim rulers from Yemen to Sumatra against European encroachment. But Suleiman's legacy was not just military. He presided over what is often considered the golden age of Ottoman culture. The great architect Mimar Sinan built some of the most beautiful mosques and public buildings in the Islamic world, structures like the Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, which rivals and in some ways surpasses the Hagia Sophia in its grandeur. Poets flourished at Suleiman's court. The Sultan himself wrote poetry in Persian and Turkish under the pen name Muhibbi, the lover. Historians recorded the deeds of the dynasty. Miniature painters created illuminated manuscripts of exquisite detail. The legal scholar Abbasid Effendi worked with Suleiman to systematize the canon, the secular law that complemented the Sharia, creating a comprehensive legal code that regulated everything from taxation to land tenure to criminal justice. This codification was important because the Ottoman Empire was extraordinarily diverse, encompassing dozens of different ethnic groups, multiple religious communities, and regions with very different traditions and economic systems. From the Balkans to Arabia, from the Crimea to North Africa, the empire stretched across climates and cultures that seemed to have little in common. Managing this diversity required a sophisticated administrative system, and the Ottomans developed one. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by a beylerbey, a provincial governor who was responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and providing troops when the sultan called for them. Below the provincial level were smaller districts, each with its own administrators and judges. The key to Ottoman governance was a certain pragmatism, a willingness to allow local customs and laws to continue as long as they didn't conflict with the sultan's authority and as long as taxes were paid. The empire didn't seek to impose cultural uniformity. Christians remained Christian, Jews remained Jewish, and they were organized into millets, religious communities that had considerable autonomy in managing their own internal affairs. The Greek Orthodox millet, headed by the Patriarch in Istanbul, governed its own members in matters of family law, education, and religious practice. The same was true for the Armenian millet, the Jewish millet, and others. This system meant that the empire could incorporate vastly different populations without constant rebellion, because people were allowed to maintain their identities and traditions. Of course, this system also created hierarchies and inequalities. Muslims were the ruling class, exempt from certain taxes that non-Muslims had to pay, particularly the jizya, the poll tax on non-Muslims. Non-Muslims could not serve in the military in the traditional cavalry units, though as we've seen, Christian boys could be taken in the devshirm and converted to serve as janissaries. Non-Muslims could not testify against Muslims in court, though they could testify against each other. In practice, though, many non-Muslims thrived within the empire, particularly in commerce and finance, areas where their networks and skills made them valuable. Greek merchants dominated much of the Black Sea trade. Armenian merchants had networks that stretched across Asia. Jewish merchants and physicians held positions of influence. The Ottoman system was not egalitarian, but compared to the religious intolerance of contemporary Europe, where Jews were being expelled and Protestants and Catholics were slaughtering each other, the Ottoman millet system seemed relatively tolerant. Suleiman's personal life was marked by both love and tragedy in ways that would have consequences for the empire. Unlike most sultans, who maintained harems of many women, Suleiman became devoted to one woman, a slave girl from Ruthenia, a region in what is now Ukraine, who was known as Hurrem Sultan or, in the West, as Roxlana. Hurrem was intelligent, politically astute, and ambitious. She bore Suleiman several sons and managed to maneuver herself from the position of a slave concubine to that of legal wife, an unprecedented achievement. She also involved herself in politics, corresponding with foreign rulers, influencing appointments, and working to ensure that her sons would succeed to the throne. The traditional Ottoman system of succession was brutal. There was no clear law of primogeniture. Any son of a sultan could potentially claim the throne, which meant that when a sultan died, his sons typically fought a civil war until one emerged victorious and killed his brothers to eliminate rival claims. This fratricide was even legally sanctioned under the canon. Mehmed the Conqueror had explicitly written into law that a sultan could execute his brothers for the sake of the order of the world. The reasoning was that a brief period of violence and bloodshed at succession was preferable to prolonged civil war. It was a cruel calculus, but one that had a certain logic in the context of a vast empire where divided succession could lead to collapse. Suleiman had several talented sons, but the succession became a source of intrigue and tragedy. His eldest son, Mustafa, from a different mother, was widely admired and considered the most capable. But Hurrem and her allies apparently convinced Suleiman that Mustafa was plotting rebellion. In 1553, Suleiman summoned Mustafa to his campaign tent in Eregli and had him strangled by mute executioners while he watched. The sources suggest that Suleiman immediately regretted this act, but it was done. The Janissaries, who had loved Mustafa, nearly mutinied. Hurrem's sons were now in line for the throne, but two of them died before Suleiman, one of illness and one possibly poisoned by the other. When Suleiman died in 1566 during a campaign in Hungary, the succession went to Hurrem's son Selim, known as Selim the Sought for his drinking, a much less capable man than his father or his executed half-brother Mustafa. Suleiman died in his tent, and his death was kept secret for weeks while his Grand Vizier, Suleiman Pasha, managed an orderly withdrawal of the army and ensured that Selim could reach Istanbul and secure the throne. When Suleiman's death was finally announced, his body was brought back to Istanbul and buried in a mausoleum next to the Suleimani Mosque. He had ruled for 46 years, presided over the empire at its zenith, expanded its borders to their greatest extent, and left behind a legacy of law and culture that would shape the empire for the rest of its existence. But he also left behind an empire that had perhaps reached the limits of sustainable expansion, an empire that would now face the challenge not of conquest but of consolidation and, eventually, of holding on to what had been won. Selim II, who ruled from 1566 to 1574, was not the warrior his father and grandfather had been. He preferred to remain in Istanbul, leaving military campaigns to his generals. His reign saw one significant conquest, the island of Cyprus, which was taken from Venice in a brutal war that lasted from 1570 to 1571. The fall of Cyprus, particularly the siege of Famagusta where the Venetian garrison held out for nearly a year before surrendering and then being massacred despite promises of safe conduct, horrified Christian Europe. It also prompted the formation of a Holy League of Spain, Venice, and the papacy to counter Ottoman naval power. In 1571, this Holy League fleet met the Ottoman fleet at Lepanto, off the coast of Greece, in what would be the largest naval battle of the 16th century. Over 200 galleys on each side clashed in a fight that lasted for hours and left the sea covered with wreckage and bodies. The Christian fleet won decisively, destroying much of the Ottoman fleet and freeing thousands of Christian galley slaves. The news of the victory was celebrated across Europe as a sign that Ottoman power was not invincible. The young Miguel de Cervantes, future author of Don Quixote, fought in the battle and lost the use of his left hand. But the strategic significance of Lepanto was less than its psychological impact. The Ottomans rebuilt their fleet within a year, and they kept Cyprus. The Grand Vizier Suleiman Pasha reportedly told the Venetian ambassador that the loss of Cyprus to Venice was like shaving your beard, which would grow back, while the loss of the fleet to the Ottomans was like cutting off an arm, and yet we have rebuilt our arm. The Ottomans remained the dominant naval power in the eastern Mediterranean. Still, Lepanto marked a symbolic turning point. The age of unquestioned Ottoman expansion was ending. When Selim died in 1574, he was succeeded by his son Murad III, who ruled until 1595. Murad's reign saw continued warfare on multiple fronts, particularly a long and exhausting war with Persia that lasted from 1578 to 1590 and resulted in Ottoman gains in the Caucasus but at enormous cost. The war drained the treasury and required constant mobilization of troops. Meanwhile, in Europe, the long peace with the Habsburgs broke down, and intermittent warfare resumed along the Hungarian frontier. It was also during Murad's reign that some of the structural problems that would plague the later empire began to become more apparent. The Devshirme system was being corrupted. Increasingly, Muslim-born Turks were being admitted to the Janissary corps, which had originally been composed only of converted Christian boys. The Janissaries were also beginning to marry and pass their positions to their sons, creating a hereditary military caste. This undermined the meritocratic aspects of the system and created a powerful interest group in the capital that could and would interfere in politics. The central bureaucracy was growing, creating more opportunities for corruption. Provincial governors, who had once been regularly rotated to prevent them from building independent power bases, were now sometimes buying their positions and staying in them longer, which allowed them to enrich themselves but weakened the connection between the provinces and the center. The empire's economic situation was also becoming more challenging. The influx of silver from the Americas, through trade and piracy, was causing inflation across the Mediterranean world, and the Ottomans were not immune. Prices rose, and the fixed salaries of soldiers and officials bought less, leading to discontent. Meanwhile, the traditional Ottoman land system was under strain. This system, called the Timar, had granted land revenues to cavalrymen in exchange for military service. But with continuous warfare and the shift toward firearms and infantry rather than cavalry, the Timar system was becoming less relevant, and the revenues from these lands were increasingly being diverted to the central treasury or to tax farmers who paid up front for the right to collect taxes. Murad III was succeeded by his son Mehmed III, whose reign from 1595 to 1603 was brief and troubled. Mehmed had the dubious distinction of having executed 19 of his brothers when he took the throne, the largest single act of Ottoman fratricide, an act that shocked even by Ottoman standards and suggested that the succession system was becoming unsustainable. Mehmed did lead one major campaign, going in person to Hungary in 1596 and winning the Battle of Carystes against a Habsburg Transylvanian army, but it was a hard-fought victory and demonstrated that Ottoman military superiority could no longer be taken for granted. After Mehmed's death, his son Ahmed I became sultan at the age of 13, ruling from 1603 to 1617. Ahmed is notable for several reasons. First, he did not execute his brothers, breaking the long tradition of fratricide. Instead, his brother Mustafa was confined to the palace, setting a precedent for what would become the new succession practice, the confinement of potential heirs in the caves, the cage, a set of rooms in the Topkapi Palace where princes lived in luxurious isolation, cut off from the world, until they were either executed or unexpectedly brought out to become sultan. This was more humane than fratricide, but it meant that sultans often came to the throne with no experience of governance or the outside world, having spent years or even decades in confinement. Ahmed is also remembered for building the Blue Mosque, the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, which stands across from the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul and is one of the most beautiful examples of Ottoman architecture, its interior covered with blue Iznik tiles that give it its popular name. But the most significant event of Ahmed's reign was the conclusion of the long war with the Habsburgs, which had dragged on since 1593. The war ended in 1606 with the Peace of Zivkatorak, and the terms were telling. For the first time, the Ottomans negotiated with the Habsburgs as equals rather than as tribute-paying inferiors. The Habsburgs were no longer required to pay annual tribute to the Sultan. This was a symbolic but important shift, indicating that the balance of power was changing. After Ahmed's death in 1617, the succession became confused. His brother Mustafa, who had been confined for years, was briefly made sultan but was deemed incompetent and deposed after only a few months. Ahmed's young son Osman became sultan as Osman II, but his reign was disastrous. He tried to reform the military, particularly to curb the power of the Janissaries, who had become increasingly unruly and mutinous. In 1622, the Janissaries rebelled, dragged Osman from the palace, imprisoned him, and eventually murdered him, the first time a reigning sultan had been killed by his own troops. It was a shocking breakdown of order and authority. Mustafa was restored briefly, then deposed again, and then Ahmed's son Murad IV took the throne in 1623 at the age of 11. For the early years of his reign, the empire was effectively ruled by his mother and various powerful officials while chaos reigned. Provincial rebellions broke out. The Janissaries mutinied repeatedly. The empire seemed to be falling apart. But as Murad grew older, he asserted himself with extraordinary ruthlessness. He executed anyone he suspected of disloyalty, including his own ministers and governors, reportedly killing thousands. He banned coffee, tobacco, and alcohol, enforcing these bans personally, sometimes patrolling the streets of Istanbul in disguise to catch violators whom he would execute on the spot. He was a tyrant, but he restored order through sheer force of will and terror. Murad also led military campaigns, something sultans had increasingly stopped doing. In 1638, he personally commanded the siege of Baghdad, recapturing the city from the Safavids who had taken it during the chaos of earlier decades. It was a significant victory that restored Ottoman prestige. But Murad died young, in 1640 at the age of 27, possibly from the effects of his heavy drinking despite his public temperance laws. He was succeeded by his brother Ibrahim, who had spent years in the cafes and who proved to be mentally unstable. Ibrahim's reign, from 1640 to 1648, was characterized by erratic behavior, excessive spending, and neglect of governance. Eventually, he too was deposed and executed, strangled like so many others. Ibrahim's 6-year-old son became sultan as Mehmed IV, beginning a reign that would last from 1648 to 1687, though for most of it, real power was in the hands of the Grand Viziers, particularly the members of the remarkable Koprulu family who served as Grand Viziers for much of this period. The Koprulus were a dynasty of administrators who managed to stabilize the empire and even achieve some military successes. Mehmed Koprulu, who served from 1656 to 1661, suppressed rebellions and reformed the administration with the same brutal efficiency that Murad IV had shown, executing thousands of officials he deemed corrupt or incompetent. His son Fazıl Ahmet Koprulu, who served from 1661 to 1676, led successful campaigns, conquering Crete from Venice after a war that had lasted since 1645, a siege of the main city Candia that went on for over 20 years and became legendary for its length and the suffering involved. But the most ambitious and ultimately disastrous campaign of this era was the Second Siege of Vienna in 1683. The Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, seeking glory and perhaps hoping to emulate Suleiman, led a massive army into Central Europe. Vienna was besieged with all the resources the empire could muster, but the Ottomans failed to take the city. The Habsburg Emperor had fled, but a relief force arrived, led by the Polish King John Sobieski, and in a dramatic battle on September 12, 1683, the Ottoman army was routed. Kara Mustafa fled, leaving behind his treasury, his tents, his artillery, everything. He was later executed by the Sultan's order for this failure. The defeat at Vienna marked the beginning of a long period of Ottoman retreat in Europe. The Habsburgs, along with Venice and Russia, formed a holy league and launched coordinated attacks on Ottoman territory. The Ottomans lost Hungary, which they had held for over a century and a half, in a series of defeats culminating in the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699. This treaty, which ended what was called the Great Turkish War, required the Ottomans to cede large territories, Hungary to the Habsburgs, Podolia to Poland, the Morea, and Dalmatia to Venice. It was the first time the Ottoman Empire had signed a peace treaty that involved significant territorial losses to Christian powers, and it marked a clear turning point. The age of Ottoman expansion was definitively over. The age of managing decline had begun. The 18th century would be a long, difficult period for the empire, characterized by military defeats, territorial losses, internal instability, and a growing awareness that the empire was falling behind the European powers in military technology, administrative efficiency, and economic development. Sultan Ahmed III, who ruled from 1703 to 1730, presided over what is sometimes called the Tulip period, named for the Turkish elite's fascination with tulip cultivation and garden parties, a time of relative peace and cultural flowering but also of increasing disconnect between the ruling class in Istanbul and the realities of the empire's situation. The period ended with a revolt in 1730 that deposed Ahmed and brought his nephew Mahmud I to the throne. Throughout the 18th century, the Ottomans fought repeated wars with Russia, which was expanding southward toward the Black Sea and the Balkans, seeking warm water ports and positioning itself as the protector of Orthodox Christians under Ottoman rule. The Ottoman armies, which had once been feared across Europe, were now regularly defeated by Russian forces. The Ottoman navy, which had once dominated the Mediterranean, was outclassed by European fleets. In 1770, a Russian fleet sailed all the way from the Baltic to the Aegean and destroyed the Ottoman fleet at Sezim, a humiliating defeat. By the end of the 18th century, under Sultan Selim III, who ruled from 1789 to 1807, there was a growing recognition that the empire needed to reform or perish. Selim tried to create a new, modern army trained in European methods, called the Nizam-i-Sedid, the New Order. He tried to reform the tax system, to centralize the administration, to modernize the military schools. But these reforms threatened powerful interests, particularly the Janissaries, who saw modern military reforms as a threat to their privileged position. In 1807, the Janissaries rebelled, deposed Selim, and installed his cousin Mustafa as sultan. Selim was later murdered, and Mustafa himself was soon deposed in favor of Selim's brother Mahmud II. Mahmud II, who ruled from 1808 to 1839, was determined to succeed where Selim had failed. But he faced enormous challenges. The empire was losing territory on multiple fronts. In 1812, the Ottomans signed the Treaty of Bucharest, ceding Bessarabia to Russia. In the Balkans, nationalism was rising. In 1821, Greece rebelled, seeking independence, and after a long, brutal war that drew in the European powers, particularly Russia, Britain, and France, who destroyed the Ottoman fleet at the Battle of Navarino in 1827, Greece achieved independence in 1830. It was the first time a subject people had successfully broken away from the Ottoman Empire to form an independent nation-state, and it would not be the last. In Egypt, Mehmed Ali Pasha, an Albanian officer who had been sent to Egypt during the Napoleonic Wars, had essentially made himself independent, modernizing Egypt's economy and military and refusing to follow Istanbul's orders. When Mahmud ordered Mehmed Ali to send troops to fight in Greece, Mehmed Ali complied, but when the Sultan later tried to remove him from power, Mehmed Ali rebelled. His modern, European-trained army defeated Ottoman forces repeatedly, and he nearly marched on Istanbul itself. Only European intervention, particularly by Britain and Russia, which ironically supported the Ottoman Sultan against his rebellious governor because they didn't want to see the empire collapse entirely, forced Mehmed Ali to back down. He kept Egypt as a hereditary possession, and while nominally remaining part of the Ottoman Empire, Egypt was effectively independent. Mahmud's great achievement was the destruction of the Janissaries. In 1826, he announced new military reforms and the creation of a modern army. The Janissaries, predictably, rebelled, but this time Mahmud was ready. He had positioned loyal artillery units around the Janissary barracks. When the Janissaries marched out in revolt, the artillery opened fire, slaughtering thousands. The survivors were hunted down, the Janissary Corps was abolished, and their barracks were burned. It was called the Auspicious Incident, and while it was brutal, it cleared the way for military modernization. Mahmud created a new army trained in European tactics, wearing European-style uniforms, with European advisors. Mahmud also initiated what would come to be called the Tanzimat, the reorganization, a period of intensive reforms aimed at modernizing the empire's institutions along Western lines. This process would continue under his sons Abdulmecid I, who ruled from 1839 to 1861, and Abdulaziz, who ruled from 1861 to 1876. The Tanzimat reforms touched nearly every aspect of government and society. They proclaimed equality of all Ottoman subjects regardless of religion, ending the legal distinctions between Muslims and non-Muslims, though in practice, these distinctions persisted. They reformed the tax system, the legal code, education, the bureaucracy. They created secular schools and universities. They built railroads and telegraph lines. They borrowed heavily from European banks to finance these modernization projects. But the Tanzimat created its own problems. The reforms were expensive and required borrowing from European creditors, which put the empire into debt. They disrupted traditional social structures without creating effective replacements. They created a class of Western-educated Ottoman officials who often felt more comfortable in Paris than in Anatolia and who were disconnected from the mass of the population. And most importantly, they failed to stop the territorial losses. In the Balkans, one nationalist movement after another rose up, often with the support of Russia. Serbia gained autonomy, then independence. Romania, which had been under Ottoman suzerainty, became independent. Bulgaria rose in rebellion, and when the Ottomans suppressed it with great brutality in 1876, European public opinion turned decisively against the empire. Russia used the Bulgarian massacres as a pretext to declare war in 1877. The Russian army pushed south, defeated Ottoman forces, and advanced to the outskirts of Istanbul before the European powers, particularly Britain, which feared Russian domination of Constantinople, intervened diplomatically. The Treaty of San Stefano in 1878 initially gave Russia enormous gains, including the creation of a large, pro-Russian Bulgarian state. But the other European powers forced a revision at the Congress of Berlin later that year, reducing Bulgaria's size and putting much of the Balkans under Habsburg administration. Still, the Ottomans lost enormous territories, and more importantly, lost any illusion that they could compete militarily with European powers. The late 19th century saw the reign of Sultan Abdulhamid II, who ruled from 1876 to 1909, one of the longest and most controversial reigns in Ottoman history. Abdulhamid came to power during a constitutional crisis. Reformers had pushed for a constitution and a parliament, which were promulgated in 1876, the first constitution in the Islamic world. But Abdulhamid quickly became disillusioned with parliamentary government. After the disastrous Russo-Turkish War, he suspended the constitution in 1878 and dissolved the parliament, establishing what was effectively an autocracy. Abdulhamid was a complex, paranoid ruler who governed through an extensive spy network and a censored press, who imprisoned or exiled opponents, but who also continued modernization in certain areas. He expanded education, though with careful censorship of what was taught. He extended the telegraph and railroad networks, connecting the far-flung provinces of the empire. He emphasized his role as caliph, hoping to use pan-Islamism, the idea of Muslim unity under Ottoman leadership, to counter the nationalist movements that were pulling the empire apart. He sent agents throughout the Muslim world, from North Africa to India to Southeast Asia, promoting the idea that the Sultan Caliph in Istanbul was the rightful leader of all Muslims. But the empire continued to shrink. In 1881, France occupied Tunisia, which had been an Ottoman territory. In 1882, Britain occupied Egypt, ostensibly to protect its investments and maintain order, but effectively ending Ottoman control there. In 1885, Bulgaria and Eastern Rumelia united, despite Ottoman protests. In 1897, Greece and the Ottoman Empire fought a brief war over Crete, which the Ottomans won militarily, but which resulted in Crete gaining autonomy under international administration. In the Balkans, the empire was reduced to a rump territory around Thrace and Macedonia. Inside the empire, new forces were stirring. A reform movement called the Young Turks, composed primarily of military officers, bureaucrats, and intellectuals educated in the modern schools that the Tanzimat had created, began agitating for a return to constitutional government. They admired European ideas about nationalism, progress, and popular sovereignty, but they also wanted to preserve the empire, to make it strong enough to resist European encroachment. In 1908, a faction of the Young Turks based in Macedonia, calling themselves the Committee of Union and Progress, launched a rebellion. Faced with military revolt and the threat of civil war, Abdülhamid capitulated. He restored the constitution and recalled the parliament. For a brief moment, there was euphoria throughout the empire. Christians and Muslims, Turks and Arabs and Armenians, celebrated together in the streets, believing that constitutional government would solve the empire's problems, that Ottomanism, the idea that all subjects of the empire were equal Ottoman citizens regardless of ethnicity or religion, would hold the empire together. It was a beautiful dream, but it lasted barely a year. In 1909, conservative forces attempted a counter-revolution. The Young Turks mobilized an army in Macedonia, marched on Istanbul, suppressed the rebellion, and deposed Abdülhamid, exiling him to Salonika. His brother Mehmed V became sultan, but he was a figurehead. Real power now lay with the Committee of Union and Progress, particularly with a triumvirate of leaders, Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Cemal Pasha. The Young Turks inherited a crisis. In 1911, Italy, seeking to build a colonial empire, invaded Libya, one of the last Ottoman territories in North Africa. The Ottomans fought but ultimately had to cede Libya in 1912. Worse was to come. In 1912, the Balkan states, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro, seeing the empire weakened, formed an alliance and launched a coordinated attack in what became known as the First Balkan War. In a matter of weeks, the Ottoman armies were routed. The empire lost almost all of its remaining European territories. Adrianople, which had been an Ottoman capital, fell. Constantinople itself seemed threatened. Only a small territory around the capital, the thin strip of land in Thrace, remained. In 1913, the Balkan allies fell out over how to divide the conquered territories and fought among themselves in the Second Balkan War. The Ottomans managed to recapture Adrianople, but that was the only bright spot. The Balkan Wars were a catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees fled from the Balkans into what remained of the empire, bringing with them stories of massacres and atrocities. The defeats radicalized the Young Turks, convincing them that Ottomanism had failed, that non-Turkish populations could not be trusted, and that the empire needed to become more Turkish, more centralized, more authoritarian. Into this volatile situation came the First World War. When the war broke out in July 1914 between the Allied powers, Britain, France, and Russia, and the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire initially tried to remain neutral. But the Young Turk leadership, particularly Enver Pasha, who was Minister of War, believed that the empire's only chance of survival was to ally with a strong European power that could protect it from Russia. He chose Germany, which had been providing military advisors and building railroads in the empire. In November 1914, the Ottoman Empire entered the war on the side of the Central Powers. It was a catastrophic decision. The Ottomans found themselves fighting on multiple fronts, in the Caucasus against Russia, in Mesopotamia against British forces coming from India, in Palestine and Syria against British forces coming from Egypt, at Gallipoli against a British and French amphibious invasion, in Arabia where British agents encouraged an Arab revolt against Ottoman rule. The Ottoman armies fought with great courage, particularly at Gallipoli where they defeated the Allied invasion in 1915, a victory in which a young Ottoman officer named Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, distinguished himself. But courage could not compensate for outdated equipment, poor logistics, and fighting on too many fronts against enemies with vastly superior resources. The war years were horrific for the empire's civilian population. Hundreds of thousands starved due to British blockades and Ottoman requisitioning of food for the military. Entire regions were devastated. And in this context of total war, defeat, paranoia, and radicalization, the Young Turk government made a decision that would forever stain their legacy and become the darkest chapter in Ottoman history. In 1915, claiming that the Armenian population was collaborating with the Russian enemy and threatened the empire's security, the government ordered the deportation of the Armenian population from eastern Anatolia. What followed was mass killing on an enormous scale. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 800,000 and 1.5 million Armenians died, through massacres, starvation, disease, and exposure during forced marches through the Syrian desert. Whether this constituted genocide, a deliberate attempt to eliminate the Armenian people, or was the tragic byproduct of a brutal deportation policy during wartime, remains contested, with Turkey officially denying genocide while most historians and international bodies recognize it as such. What is not disputed is that enormous numbers of innocent people, men, women, and children, died in terrible ways, and that the once large and ancient Armenian community of the Ottoman Empire was destroyed. By 1918, the Ottoman Empire was exhausted. On the various fronts, Ottoman forces were collapsing. British forces under General Allenby captured Jerusalem in December 1917 and Damascus in October 1918. British forces in Mesopotamia captured Baghdad in March 1917 and pushed north. In the Caucasus, Russian forces had advanced deep into Ottoman territory before Russia's own revolution took it out of the war. Arab forces, led by Sharif Hussein of Mecca and his sons, and advised by the British officer T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, had risen in revolt and captured Mecca, Medina eventually, and Aqaba, fighting alongside the British advance into Syria. On October 30, 1918, the Ottoman Empire signed the Armistice of Mudros, surrendering to the Allies. The Young Turk leadership fled the country, escaping on a German submarine. Allied forces occupied Istanbul, which would be under foreign occupation for the first time since the Byzantine era. The empire was finished, waiting only for the Allied powers to decide how to divide its territories. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed in August 1920, proposed to partition the empire completely. Greece would receive western Anatolia around Izmir. Italy would receive the southwest. France would receive southeastern Anatolia and Syria. Britain would receive Mesopotamia and Palestine. The Turkish heartland would be reduced to a small rump state in central Anatolia. The Straits would be internationalized. An independent Armenia would be carved out of eastern Anatolia. The Kurds would have an autonomous region with possible future independence. Ottoman sovereignty would essentially cease to exist. But the Treaty of Sèvres was never implemented, because the Turkish people, led by Mustafa Kemal, refused to accept it. Kemal, who had been the most successful Ottoman general during the war, organized resistance in Anatolia, establishing a nationalist movement and a provisional government in Ankara. When Greek forces, with Allied approval, landed in Izmir in May 1919 and began advancing into the interior, Turkish nationalist forces fought back. Over the next 3 years, from 1919 to 1922, a brutal war was fought in Anatolia. Kemal's forces gradually grew stronger, better organized, more disciplined. They drove French forces out of southeastern Anatolia. They fought Armenian forces to a standstill and then pushed them back. And most dramatically, they defeated the Greek army, which had advanced almost to Ankara, driving them back in a great offensive in 1922 and eventually all the way to the sea. Izmir, which had been held by Greece, was recaptured, and much of it burned in the process. The Turkish victory forced the Allies to renegotiate. The Treaty of Lausanne, signed in July 1923, replaced the Treaty of Sèvres. It recognized the independence and territorial integrity of the new Turkish state within roughly its modern borders, all of Anatolia and eastern Thrace. The Straits would be demilitarized but would remain under Turkish control. There would be no independent Armenia in Anatolia, no autonomous Kurdistan, no Greek zone. It was a complete reversal of the previous treaty and a remarkable achievement for Turkish nationalism. But this new state was explicitly not the Ottoman Empire. In November 1922, the Grand National Assembly in Ankara, which had been governing the nationalist movement, formally abolished the Sultanate, separating the political and religious roles that the Ottoman sultans had combined. The last sultan, Mehmed VI, who had been a puppet under Allied occupation, fled Istanbul on a British warship. In October 1923, the Turkish Republic was officially proclaimed, with Ankara as its capital and Mustafa Kemal as its president. And in March 1924, the Grand National Assembly took the final step, abolishing the caliphate and expelling all members of the Ottoman dynasty from Turkey. The Ottoman Empire, which had endured for over 6 centuries, was formally ended. The successor states that emerged from the Ottoman Empire would shape the Middle East and the Balkans for the century to come. The Arab lands that had been part of the empire were divided between Britain and France as League of Nations mandates, despite promises that had been made about Arab independence. Britain took control of Mesopotamia, which became Iraq, and Palestine, which would become the center of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. France took control of Syria and Lebanon. The Arabian Peninsula saw the rise of Ibn Saud, who would create Saudi Arabia. Egypt, while technically independent, remained under British influence until the 1950s. The Balkans had already been divided into nation-states, each with its own nationalist narrative and ethnic grievances. Looking back across the long arc of Ottoman history, from that small frontier principality under Osman in the late 13th century to the sprawling empire that controlled 3 continents at its peak in the 16th century, and then through the long centuries of adaptation and decline, what can we see? We see an empire that was remarkably successful for a very long time at managing diversity, at incorporating different peoples and allowing them to maintain their identities while being part of a larger political structure. We see a system that was in some ways more meritocratic than contemporary European feudal systems, where a peasant boy could, through the devshirm, rise to become Grand Vizier. We see a culture that produced magnificent architecture, poetry, scholarship, and art, that was a bridge between East and West, a place where Greek, Persian, and Turkish and Arab traditions mingled and influenced each other. But we also see an empire built on conquest and maintained by force, where religious minorities, while often tolerated, were never equal, where the rights of subjects were privileges granted by the ruler rather than inherent principles, where succession often meant fratricide, where reformers who threatened established interests could be deposed or murdered by the very forces they sought to change. We see an empire that struggled to adapt as the world changed around it, as European powers developed new technologies, new forms of economic organization, new political ideologies based on nationalism and popular sovereignty that challenged the very premise of multi-ethnic empire. The story of the Ottoman Empire is not a simple tale of rise and fall, though that narrative arc is certainly there. It is more complex, more human than that. It is the story of countless individuals making decisions in difficult circumstances, of sultans trying to balance competing demands, of soldiers fighting for causes they may not have fully understood, of merchants and artisans going about their daily business, of scholars preserving and transmitting knowledge, of families raising children and passing on traditions, of communities maintaining their identities across centuries of changing rule. In the centuries since the empire's end, its legacy has been contested. In Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk deliberately turned away from the Ottoman past, creating a secular, nationalist republic that rejected the imperial, Islamic identity of the Ottomans. He banned the fez, the traditional Ottoman headwear, and required Turkish men to wear Western-style hats. He replaced Arabic script with Latin letters for writing Turkish. He gave women the right to vote, abolished Islamic courts, and separated religion from the state. For decades, Turkish schoolchildren learned to view the Ottoman centuries as a period of backwardness and stagnation, something to be overcome rather than celebrated. Only in recent decades has there been a revival of interest in Ottoman history in Turkey, though how that history is understood and used remains politically charged. In the Balkans, the Ottoman centuries are often remembered as a time of oppression, a foreign occupation that delayed national development. Serbian nationalists remember the Battle of Kosovo as a tragic defeat and the subsequent centuries as a dark age. Greek nationalists view the Ottoman period as the Turkocratia, the Turkish rule, a time of slavery from which they heroically freed themselves in the 1820s. Bulgarian, Romanian, and Albanian nationalists have similar narratives of suffering under Ottoman rule and eventual liberation. These national narratives often simplify a more complex reality, one where many local elites collaborated with Ottoman rule and benefited from it, where some periods saw relative prosperity and stability, and where the lines between oppressor and oppressed were not always clear. In the Arab world, the Ottoman legacy is also complicated. Arab nationalists in the 20th century often portrayed Ottoman rule as a foreign, Turkish domination that suppressed Arab identity and development. They celebrated the Arab revolt of the First World War as a national awakening. But this narrative has been challenged by historians who point out that many Arabs were loyal Ottoman subjects, that Arab elites held high positions in the Ottoman administration, that Arabic was one of the empire's official languages, and that the division of the Arab lands after World War I into British and French mandates and then into multiple nation-states was in many ways more damaging than Ottoman rule had been. For the Jewish communities of the empire, particularly the Sephardic Jews who had been welcomed after their expulsion from Spain, the Ottoman centuries were often remembered as a golden age of relative tolerance and prosperity, especially when compared to the persecutions they had faced in Christian Europe. The Armenian genocide of 1915 casts a long shadow over Armenian memory of the Ottoman period, though Armenians had lived in the empire for centuries before that catastrophe, and many had achieved success in commerce, crafts, and even in Ottoman administration. The physical legacy of the empire is everywhere in the lands it once ruled. The mosques, bridges, caravanserais, and fortresses built by Ottoman architects still stand, from Budapest to Baghdad, from Sarajevo to Damascus. The Blue Mosque and the Suleiman Mosque in Istanbul remain among the world's most beautiful buildings. The Mostar Bridge in Bosnia, destroyed during the Yugoslav wars but rebuilt, symbolizes both Ottoman architectural achievement and the region's tragic conflicts. Ottoman documents fill archives, written in Ottoman Turkish, a language that used Arabic script but incorporated Persian and Arabic vocabulary into Turkish grammar, a linguistic reflection of the empire's cultural synthesis. The administrative and legal legacy is more ambiguous. The Ottoman system of managing religious diversity through the millet system influenced how successor states approached minority rights, though often in the breach rather than the observance. The arbitrary borders drawn by European colonial powers after World War I, dividing the Arab provinces of the former empire, created states that often had little geographic or demographic logic, contributing to conflicts that persist to this day. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the instability of Iraq and Syria, the Kurdish question that spans multiple borders, all of these have roots in how the Ottoman Empire ended and how its territories were divided. In the realm of ideas, the Ottoman experience raises profound questions about empire, diversity, and modernization. Can large, multi-ethnic empires provide stability and allow diverse communities to coexist, or are nation-states based on ethnic or linguistic identity more legitimate? The 20th century saw the collapse of all the great multi-ethnic empires, Ottoman, Habsburg, Russian, and their replacement by nation-states. But those nation-states often struggled to accommodate their own minorities, leading to ethnic cleansing, forced population exchanges, and genocides. The unmixing of peoples, the creation of ethnically homogeneous states, was often brutally violent. Looking back, some historians have argued that there was something to be said for the Ottoman model of allowing communities to maintain distinct identities within a larger political framework, even with all its inequalities and problems. The question of modernization is equally complex. The Ottoman Empire spent the 19th and early 20th centuries trying desperately to modernize, to adopt Western technology, military organization, legal codes, and administrative practices. But modernization was expensive, disruptive, and often incomplete. It required borrowing from European creditors, which led to debt and eventually to foreign financial control. It required training people in Western methods, which created a class of westernized elites who were often alienated from the mass of the population. It required challenging traditional power structures, which led to resistance and instability. And ultimately, despite all the reforms, the empire could not match the economic and military power of the European states, in part because it started from a position of relative backwardness and in part because those European states actively worked to keep the empire weak, seeing a divided Middle East as serving their interests. Mustafa Kemal's solution in Turkey was radical westernization, the complete transformation of society from the top down, creating a modern, secular, nation-state on European models. This was successful in many ways. Turkey became a functioning modern state with a literate population, industrial development, and military power. But it also created tensions that persist, between secularists and Islamists, between Turks and Kurds, between those who embrace European identity and those who emphasize Turkish or Islamic identity. The Ottoman past became a contested symbol in these debates, either something to reject as backward or something to reclaim as a source of pride and identity. The First World War was the end not just of the Ottoman Empire but of an entire world system, the world of empires that had dominated for centuries. The Habsburgs, the Romanovs, the Hohenzollerns, the Ottomans, all fell between 1917 and 1923. What replaced them was a world of nation-states, at least in theory, though in practice, European colonial empires persisted until after the Second World War. The principle of national self-determination, championed by Woodrow Wilson, seemed to promise a more just international order. But as it played out, self-determination was granted to some peoples and denied to others based on the interests of the great powers. The Arabs were told they would have independence but got British and French mandates instead. The Kurds were promised consideration for a state but were divided among Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran. The Armenians lost what little chance they had for an independent state when Turkish nationalist forces defeated them. In the Ottoman heartland, what emerged was something genuinely new, not a restoration of the empire but a modern nation-state that deliberately rejected much of the Ottoman heritage. Ataturk's Turkey was revolutionary in its scope. It replaced Islamic law with European legal codes. It gave women rights that few Muslim countries would match for decades. It industrialized rapidly. It created a sense of Turkish national identity that had not really existed before, forging together the diverse Turkish-speaking peoples of Anatolia into a single nation. But this nation-building came at a cost. The Christian populations, Armenians, Greeks, Assyrians, were largely gone, victims of genocide, massacres, population exchanges, and flight. The Kurdish population, which made up perhaps 15 to 20% of Turkey, was expected to assimilate, to become Turks, and when they resisted, they faced repression. The Ottoman cosmopolitanism, the idea of a society where multiple peoples maintained distinct identities while sharing a common political structure, was replaced by the homogenizing force of nationalism. This same dynamic played out across the former Ottoman lands. In the Balkans, the successor states, Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, Romania, engaged in projects of national homogenization, expelling or forcibly assimilating minorities. The population exchanges between Greece and Turkey after the Greco-Turkish War of 1919 to 1922 saw over 1 million Greeks expelled from Anatolia and nearly 500,000 Muslims expelled from Greece, not based on language or ethnicity but purely on religion. Ancient communities were uprooted, and the mixing of peoples that had characterized the Eastern Mediterranean for millennia was undone in a few brutal years. In the Arab lands, the story was different but no less troubled. The British and French mandates ruled with the logic of colonial administration, extracting resources, controlling strategic territory, and maintaining order, but not preparing these territories for genuine independence. When independence came, mostly after the Second World War, it often came to states with arbitrary borders, weak institutions, and deep divisions. The monarchies installed by the British in Iraq and Jordan struggled with legitimacy. Syria and Lebanon fell into sectarian conflicts. Palestine became the site of a conflict between Jewish immigrants seeking a homeland and Palestinian Arabs who had lived there for centuries, a conflict rooted in incompatible promises made by the British during World War I. The discovery of oil in the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf in the 1930s transformed the region's importance to global powers, ensuring that the Middle East would remain a site of great power competition throughout the 20th century and beyond. The Cold War saw the United States and Soviet Union compete for influence in the region. Israel's establishment in 1948 and the subsequent Arab-Israeli wars created a new dynamic of conflict. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 created a Shia Islamic republic that challenged both Western influence and Sunni monarchies. The Gulf Wars, the War on Terror, the Arab Spring, the Syrian Civil War, all of these conflicts of the late 20th and early 21st centuries have roots that can be traced back, at least in part, to how the Ottoman Empire ended and how its territories were reorganized. To sit with this history, in the quiet of this late hour, is to feel the weight of centuries, the accumulation of choices and chances, of human ambition and human suffering, of glory and tragedy intertwined. The Ottoman Empire was built by the sword but maintained by administration, by pragmatism, by a willingness to adapt and incorporate. It gave the world remarkable architecture, poetry, and scholarship. It provided a framework within which diverse peoples coexisted, however imperfectly. But it was also built on conquest and domination, on the subjugation of peoples who had no say in their governance, on a system where power flowed from the top down and where the sultan's will was, in theory, absolute. The men who ruled the empire, those sultans whose names echo through history, Osman, Orhan, Murad, Mehmed, Suleiman, Selim, Mahmud, they were neither heroes nor villains but human beings navigating circumstances of extraordinary complexity. Some were wise and capable, others weak or cruel, most were some mixture of both. They made decisions that affected millions of lives, often with imperfect information and under tremendous pressure. They were shaped by the values and assumptions of their times, and we cannot fairly judge them by the standards of ours, though neither should we refrain from moral judgment entirely. The people who lived under Ottoman rule, the vast majority who never held power, who never made policy, who simply tried to live their lives, raise their families, practice their trades, and worship their gods, their experiences were varied beyond any simple generalization. Some prospered under Ottoman rule, some suffered, most did some of both at different times. Some identified with the empire and served it loyally, some resisted and rebelled, most accommodated themselves to authority while maintaining their own identities and communities. Their voices are harder to hear in the historical record, which tends to preserve the words of the powerful, but they were the real substance of the empire, the millions of lives lived in the shadow of sultans and grand viziers. The legacy of the Ottoman Empire in our present world is everywhere, though often unrecognized. When we see conflict in the Middle East or the Balkans, we are seeing, in part, the consequences of how the empire ended and how its territories were divided. When we see Turkey navigating between its European associations and its Islamic heritage, between secularism and religion, between authoritarianism and democracy, we are seeing a country still working through the contradictions and choices that emerged from the imperial past and the revolutionary break with it. When we see the cosmopolitan heritage of cities like Istanbul, Sarajevo, or Jerusalem, places where multiple cultures and religions have coexisted, however tensely, we are seeing the residue of Ottoman pluralism. There is a tendency, in looking at history, to search for simple lessons, to find clear morals in the stories of the past. But the Ottoman story resists simple lessons. It tells us that empires can endure for centuries through flexibility and pragmatism, but that they eventually fall when they cannot adapt to changing circumstances. It tells us that diversity can be managed, that peoples of different faiths and ethnicities can coexist within a single political structure, but that this coexistence is always fraught, always requiring careful management, and that it can break down catastrophically when crisis comes. It tells us that modernization is necessary for survival in a competitive world, but that modernization is disruptive and painful and does not guarantee success. It tells us that the end of empires is rarely clean or just, that the drawing of new borders often creates as many problems as it solves, and that the national self-determination that seems so appealing as a principle can be brutal and violent in practice. Perhaps the most important thing the Ottoman story tells us is that history is not inevitable, that the world we live in now is the result of countless contingencies, of battles that might have gone differently, of decisions that might have been otherwise, of plagues and famines and lucky breaks and terrible mistakes. If Bayezid had not fought Timur at Ankara, if Mehmed had not taken Constantinople, if the Ottomans had not entered World War I, if the Greeks had not invaded Anatolia in 1919, the world would look different today. We cannot know how it would look, but it would be different. History is made by human choices, which means that different choices would have made different history. And yet, there are also deeper currents in history that are harder for individuals to change. The rise of Europe, driven by the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, industrialization, and capitalism, created a profound power imbalance by the 19th century. No amount of Ottoman reform could quickly close the gap in wealth, technology, and military power that had opened up. The rise of nationalism as an ideology, the sense that political boundaries should correspond to ethnic or linguistic communities, undermined the legitimacy of multi-ethnic empires everywhere, not just the Ottoman. The development of modern weapons, from rifled muskets to machine guns to artillery, changed the nature of warfare in ways that favored states with industrial economies and centralized administrations. These were forces beyond the control of any individual sultan or grand vizier, forces that shaped the possible and the impossible. So we sit here, at the end of this long journey through Ottoman history, and we might ask ourselves, what was it all for? 600 years of empire, of conquest and administration, of culture and cruelty, of magnificent buildings and terrible wars, what did it amount to? The empire is gone. The sultans are gone. The system is gone. What remains? What remains are the stones and the stories. The stones of the mosques and bridges and fortresses, still standing, still beautiful, still functional in many cases, testament to human craft and ambition. The stories in the archives and chronicles and poems, waiting for historians to read them, for filmmakers to adapt them, for novelists to reimagine them, keeping alive the memory of people and events that might otherwise be forgotten. What remains are the languages that still carry Ottoman words, Turkish with its Persian and Arabic borrowings, Arabic with its Turkish administrative terms, Greek and Serbian and Bulgarian with linguistic traces of centuries of Ottoman rule. What remains are the cities, Istanbul above all, that glorious impossible city on two continents, but also Sarajevo and Damascus and Cairo and dozens of others, cities whose very layouts, whose street patterns and market quarters and religious districts, still bear the imprint of Ottoman urban planning. What remains are the questions about how diverse peoples can live together, about how empires rise and fall, about how societies modernize and what they lose in the process, about how we should remember difficult pasts, about the relationship between religion and politics, about the meaning of justice and power and legitimacy. These questions do not have simple answers, but engaging with them, thinking through them in the context of actual historical experience rather than in abstract theory, is valuable. The Ottoman story provides a rich, complex case study for thinking about these enduring questions. And what remains, most fundamentally, is the reminder that the world has not always been as it is now, that the nations and borders and identities that seem fixed and natural to us are actually recent constructions, built on the ruins of earlier orders. 600 years ago, there was no Turkish nation-state, no Syria or Iraq, no Greece or Bulgaria in their modern forms. There was the Ottoman Empire and its rivals. 600 years from now, who knows what political structures will exist, what identities people will claim, what languages they will speak. The Ottoman Empire lasted longer than most nation-states have existed so far. Nothing is permanent. Everything is contingent. That thought might be unsettling, or it might be liberating, depending on your perspective and your situation. For those who lived through the empire's end, it must have felt like the end of the world. For Sultan Mehmed VI, fleeing Istanbul on a British warship, his empire dissolved, his authority gone, his family exiled, how must that have felt? For the refugees streaming out of the Balkans, or out of Anatolia, leaving behind homes their families had occupied for generations, how must that have felt? For the soldiers who fought and died in wars that ultimately changed nothing, that could not prevent the empire's collapse, what did their sacrifices mean? For the reformers who worked so hard to modernize the empire, who truly believed they could save it, only to see it fall apart anyway, how must that have felt? But for others, the empire's end meant liberation, meant possibility. For Greek nationalists celebrating independence, for Arab nationalists imagining Arab unity, for Turkish nationalists building a new republic, for them, the end of the empire was a beginning. And for still others, it meant little, their daily lives continuing much as before, because for most people, most of the time, the grand political structures matter less than the immediate concerns of family and livelihood and community. As we come to the close of this long night's journey through Ottoman history, as the story winds down and draws towards silence, there is a kind of peace in simply having told it, in having traced the arc from beginning to end, from Osman's small principality to the vast empire to the final dissolution. It is a complete story, with a clear beginning and a clear end, which is rare in history. Most historical processes don't have neat boundaries, they fade into what came before and what came after. But the Ottoman Empire, named for its founder and ended by deliberate political act, has a narrative shape that satisfies our human need for stories with beginnings, middles, and ends. And now the story has been told, here in this quiet space, in this gentle hour. The sultans have risen and fallen. The armies have marched and fought. The cities have been built and besieged. The peoples have lived and died, have celebrated and mourned, have hoped and despaired. The empire has been born, has grown, has flowered, has withered, and has ended. All of this has passed, like everything passes, like we ourselves will pass, but for a time it was real, it was vital, it was the framework within which millions of people made sense of their world. There is something consoling in historical perspective, in stepping back far enough to see the whole arc, to see that what seemed permanent was temporary, that what seemed overwhelming was manageable, that what seemed unique was part of larger patterns. Empires rise and fall. Powers shift. Ideas emerge, flourish, and fade. And through it all, ordinary human life continues, people finding moments of beauty and connection, of love and creativity, even in difficult times, even under empire, even in war. The Ottoman Empire gave the world much that was beautiful. The arabesques of Iznik tiles, the soaring domes of Sinan's mosques, the verses of classical Turkish poetry, the intricate melodies of Ottoman court music, the delicate art of marbled paper called Ebru, the craftsmanship of silver and gold and jewels. It also inflicted suffering, the violence of conquest, the harshness of rule, the tragedy of the Armenian genocide, the costs of wars. Both are true. Both must be remembered. The beauty does not excuse the suffering, and the suffering does not negate the beauty. They coexist in history as they coexist in human experience. For 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire was a fact of the world, as real and solid as mountains. And then it was gone, dissolved in the space of a few years in the early 1920s. How fragile human constructions are, even the ones that seem most permanent. And yet how resilient they are too, how they leave traces, how they shape what comes after even in their absence. The Ottoman Empire is gone, but its ghost walks through the modern Middle East and Balkans, its decisions still shaping borders and conflicts, its cultural synthesis still present in the habits and assumptions of millions of people who may not even know the history. And so we arrive at the end, here in the deep quiet of night, having traveled together through more than 600 years, from the mists of 13th century Anatolia to the wreckage of 1923. It has been a long journey, full of names and dates and battles and treaties, but I hope it has also been more than that. I hope it has been a journey into the texture of lived experience, into the rhythms of daily life, into the hopes and fears of people who lived in a world very different from ours but who were, in their essential humanity, not so different from us. The darkness outside is perhaps beginning to lighten, just barely, the first hint of dawn still hours away but no longer unimaginable. The story has been told. The empire has run its course. The long night of history has unfolded, event following event, generation following generation, until we reach our present moment, looking back at what was. There is peace in endings, in reaching the natural conclusion of a story, in seeing the whole shape of something from beginning to end. The Ottoman Empire was. It existed. It mattered. It is gone. Those simple statements contain within them the stories of countless lives, the efforts of countless hands and minds, the accumulated experiences of a substantial portion of humanity over 6 centuries. It is worth remembering, worth studying, worth understanding, not to glorify it or to condemn it but simply to know it, to add it to our understanding of what humans have done and can do, for better and worse. Rest now, kind listener. The story has been told. The empire has risen and fallen like the sun, like all things rise and fall. You have followed it from beginning to end, through all those centuries, through all those lives. That was the story of the Ottoman Empire, complete now, laid to rest in the past where it belongs, but alive here in memory, in this moment of shared contemplation, in this peaceful space we have created together in the night. The noise of today seems very far away now. The present moment, with all its urgency and anxiety, has receded into the background as we have walked together through the past. But now we return, gently, to the present, to this room, this bed, this quiet hour. The Ottoman Empire has ended its story, but your story continues. May you carry forward whatever peace you have found in this journey. May the weight of history remind you that all things pass, that nothing lasts forever, that there is both sadness and comfort in impermanence. Sleep well, dear listener, if sleep is what you seek. Or if you are simply resting, letting your mind wander through the landscapes of the past, then rest well. You have been good company on this long journey. Thank you for walking with me through the centuries. Thank you for listening to the stories of people long dead, of an empire long gone, of a world that no longer exists except in memory and in the stones that still stand beneath the same sky. The story is complete. The journey is finished. The empire has been born, has lived, and has died. All is told. All is done. Rest now in the quiet certainty that stories end, that empires fall, that even the mightiest powers of earth eventually return to dust, but that for a time, they were magnificent. And that magnificence, that striving, that human effort to build something lasting, that is worth remembering, worth honoring, even as we acknowledge that nothing truly lasts. The Ottoman Empire has entered history now, where all things eventually go. It has taken its place in the long procession of human civilizations, each rising in its turn, flourishing for a time, and then giving way to what comes after. That is the way of things. That is the pattern. And there is something peaceful in accepting that pattern, in seeing your own life and concerns as part of a much larger flow of time, where everything that seems urgent now will eventually be history too, will eventually be a story told on some quiet night to help someone find peace. So rest. Be at peace. The story is told. The empire is gone. The night is deep and quiet. And you are here, now, safe and comfortable, having walked with me through 6 centuries and emerged on the other side, into the present moment, which is all any of us truly have. May you find in this moment the peace that comes from perspective, from understanding that all things pass, that all storms eventually calm, that all stories eventually end. Good night, dear listener. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. May your rest be deep and your dreams be peaceful. The Ottoman Empire has ended its long journey, and so have we. All is well. All is complete. All is at rest now in the gentle darkness of history.